The moment our commander slapped the human diplomat, everyone in the room thought she would cry. 5 seconds later, his head was rolling across the negotiation floor, and that was the exact moment our empire realized humans had been lying about one thing. My name is Torvex Bellic, and if you are listening to this recording, congratulations, you have chosen to hear the true story of the day my commander lost his head, literally, not metaphorically. Not in some poetic sense where I say he lost his head with rage and you nod along thinking it is a clever turn of phrase. No, his actual head, detached from his actual shoulders, rolling across a very expensive, very polished floor on a station that cost more credits than my entire homeworld's yearly budget. I was there, I saw it happen, and I have replayed it in my mind roughly 4,000 times since, mostly because I still cannot quite believe it, and partly because, if I am being honest with you, it was the single most entertaining afternoon of my entire miserable career. Let me back up. I worked, as a logistics officer for the Dravith Imperium, which is a fancy way of saying I move boxes, count boxes, and occasionally yell at other people who cannot count boxes properly. It is not glamorous. Nobody writes songs about logistics officers. Nobody carves statues of the man who made sure the ambassador's snacks arrived on time, but somebody has to do it, and apparently that somebody was me. My species, the Dravith, likes to think of itself as the pinnacle of civilized development in this section of the galaxy. We are tall, we are strong, we have skin like polished granite, and we have been flying between stars since before humanity figured out that rubbing 2 sticks together makes fire. We remind everyone of this constantly. It is, frankly, exhausting. I have sat through so many speeches about Dravith's superiority that I could recite them backwards while asleep, and honestly I think I have, because I wake up some mornings feeling like I already gave the speech. So when the Imperium agreed to hold trade and territory negotiations with a species called humans, on a neutral station called Kestrion Hub, most of my colleagues treated it like a formality, a box to check, a minor inconvenience before we informed these humans exactly how things were going to work from now on. I did not share that confidence, for one simple reason. I had read the reports. You see, most of my fellow Dravith do not read reports. They skim the summaries, they nod, they say something like, yes, primitive species, weak biology, short lifespans, easily managed, and then they go back to admiring themselves in reflective surfaces. But I read the actual reports. All of them. And there was something strange buried in the data about humans that nobody seemed to want to talk about. They kept surviving things that should have killed them. Not just surviving, thriving. Fighting off diseases that wiped out other species. Building weapons out of scraps. Negotiating their way out of situations where every rational calculation said they should have lost. There was a phrase in one particularly old file, something a previous scout had written before he mysteriously stopped filing reports altogether. He wrote, and I remember this clearly because it made me laugh out loud in an otherwise silent records room, "Do not corner a human. They do not understand the concept of a lost cause. They will simply redefine the cause until it is not lost anymore." I filed that thought away in my head under a category I mentally labeled, "Things my commander will absolutely ignore." Because my commander, Craxil Dorn, was exactly the kind of Dravith who skimmed summaries and admired his own reflection. Let me tell you about Craxil Dorn, because you need to understand this man before I tell you what happened to him. Commander Dorn had never lost an argument in his life. Not because he was particularly clever. He was not stupid, to be fair, but he was not a genius either. He won arguments the way a boulder wins an argument with a pebble, which is to say, through sheer mass and an unwillingness to move. He had climbed through the ranks of the Imperium military by being loud, by being confident, and by never once admitting he might be wrong about anything, ever, under any circumstances. He wore his medals the way some people wear cologne, which is to say, far too much of them and clearly hoping you would notice. He had a voice that could fill a room without him even trying, and he used it constantly, on subjects ranging from military strategy to the correct way to fold a napkin. He genuinely believed with his entire granite heart that the Dravith Imperium was the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever produced, and that everyone else, humans very much included, existed somewhere on a spectrum between amusing and obstacle. He had never been slapped, insulted, challenged, or told no in his entire adult life. I want you to sit with that fact for a moment, because it becomes very important later. The day the humans arrived on Kestrian Hub, I was standing near the docking bay with a datapad, doing my actual job, which was making sure the cargo manifests matched what was physically being unloaded. Commander Dorn stood a few paces away, hands clasped behind his back, chest puffed out like a bird trying to impress a mate that had already left the building. The human shuttle docked with a hiss and a clank that sounded almost apologetic compared to our own vessels. The door opened, and out walked two humans. The first was a woman, average height for her species, dark hair pulled back tight, wearing a dark gray suit that looked simple but somehow more authoritative than every single medal on Dorn's chest combined. Her name, I would later learn, was Elena Vasquez. She walked like someone who had never once questioned whether she belonged in the room she was walking into. Behind her walked a man in a plain uniform, broad shoulders, an expression that suggested he found everything mildly funny in a way he had no intention of sharing with the rest of us. His name was Sergeant Cole Ramirez, listed on the manifest simply as security escort, which I would later realize was possibly the most understated job title in the history of job titles. Commander Dorn stepped forward to greet them, and I watched him do the thing he always did. The slow up and down glance, the little exhale through his nose that he thought was subtle but was about as subtle as a collapsing star. "So," he said, in Draveth accented common trade, "these are the humans." Elena Vasquez extended a hand. Elena Vasquez, lead negotiator for the Terran delegation. Dorn looked at the hand like it might be contagious, then shook it anyway. Briefly, the way you might touch something you were not entirely sure was clean. "Commander Craxil Dorn," he said, "I trust your journey was not too taxing on your species. I understand your biology is quite fragile." I nearly dropped my datapad. Not because it was rude, though it was, but because it was so unnecessarily rude, delivered as an opening line, before they had even walked 10 steps onto the station. Elena Vasquez did not flinch. She smiled, the kind of smile that does not quite reach the eyes, and said, "We manage." That was it. 2 words. And somehow those 2 words carried more weight than Dorn's entire opening statement. I remember thinking, right there in that docking bay, this is going to be interesting. Over the following 2 days, I was assigned to assist with logistics for the negotiation chamber itself, which meant I got a front-row seat to what I can only describe as a very slow, very tense chess match between a boulder and a blade. The negotiation chamber was a circular room with a long table in the center, Draveth delegation on one side, human delegation on the other, with Ambassador Rena Sol presiding as the closest thing we had to a neutral moderator, though everyone knew her sympathies leaned Draveth because, well, she was Draveth. Ambassador Sol was, in my opinion, one of the few genuinely reasonable people in our delegation. She was older, her granite skin weathered with faint cracks that Draveth consider a mark of wisdom rather than age, and she had actually read the reports too. I could tell by the way she watched the humans, carefully, respectfully. The way you watch something you are not entirely sure you understand yet. The talks began simply enough. Trade routes, mining rights, border definitions in a contested sector of space neither side technically owned but both sides desperately wanted. Standard diplomatic friction, the kind that happens between any 2 powers trying to divide up resources without starting a war over it. But Commander Dorn could not help himself. Every few minutes he would insert some small comment, some little dig, dressed up as an observation. "Your ships are remarkably slow," he said at one point, examining a data display of a human vessel. "I suppose that is understandable, given your limited grasp of propulsion theory." Elena Vasquez did not even look up from her own notes. "Slow enough to have crossed 4 star systems in the time it took your delegation to agree on a meeting time." A ripple of quiet laughter went through some of the junior Draveth officers before they caught themselves and stopped. I did not laugh out loud, but internally, I was cheering so hard I nearly dropped my datapad for the second time that week. Dorn's jaw tightened, just slightly, a small crack in that boulder exterior. I was merely noting a technical observation, and I was merely correcting it, Elena replied, still not looking up. Shall we continue with the border discussion, or would you like to make more technical observations? Ambassador Sol cleared her throat, the diplomatic equivalent of stepping between two people about to start throwing punches. Perhaps we should return to the matter of the Kesserine belt, and so they did, for a while. But I noticed something over those 2 days. Every single time Dorn tried to score a point through insult rather than argument, Elena Vasquez turned it right back around on him, calmly, efficiently, without ever raising her voice. She never once looked rattled. She never once looked angry, not even when he got personal, which he did, more and more, as the days went on and his frustration grew. Sergeant Cole Ramirez, for his part, said almost nothing during the actual talks. He sat slightly behind and to the side of Elena, arms crossed, watching the room with the calm attentiveness of a man watching a pot of water that he knew eventually was going to boil. Occasionally, when Dorn said something particularly absurd, I saw the corner of Cole's mouth twitch, like he was suppressing a laugh he knew better than to let out. By the third day, the talks had moved to the most contested issue of all. A mineral-rich system both delegations wanted. A system that, if I am honest, probably was not worth the diplomatic headache it was causing, but pride does strange things to negotiations. Dorn had prepared what he clearly believed was his masterstroke, a lengthy speech about Draveth historical claims to the region, backed up with charts, timelines, ancient treaties from Draveth colonies that had admittedly existed in that region long before humanity had even developed spaceflight. It was, to be fair, a decent argument, for about the first 3 minutes. Then Dorn, never one to leave a good point alone, decided to editorialize. "You must understand," he said, leaning back with the smug satisfaction of a man who believes he has already won. "Your species simply has not existed long enough as a spacefaring civilization to claim any meaningful stake here. You are, in the grand scheme of galactic history, children. Loud, stubborn children who happen to stumble upon technology before you were mature enough to use it responsibly." The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of diplomatic pause, the other quiet, the one where everyone in the room, human and Draveth alike, suddenly becomes very interested in their own hands. Elena Vasquez set down her datapad, slowly, deliberately, the way you set down something when you want the sound of it hitting the table to be heard. "Commander," she said, her voice perfectly level, "children who built the technology to reach this table in under 200 years, after nearly annihilating themselves twice, are not children. They are something your species has apparently never had to be." Dorn's granite face darkened, a shade I had genuinely never seen on him before. "And what, precisely, is that?" "Desperate," Elena said. "You have never had to claw your way up from nothing while the clock was running out. We have. Twice. And we are still here. So forgive me if I do not find your history lecture particularly intimidating. I want you to understand this was not an insult. Not really. It was, if anything, a fairly measured, fairly reasonable response to an insult that had been thrown first. But Commander Craxel Dorn had never in his entire life been spoken to that way by anyone, let alone by a member of a species he considered beneath him. Something in his face shifted. I saw it happen in real time, the exact moment his composure cracked. His jaw clenched, his hands resting on the table, curled slowly into fists. Ambassador Sol must have seen it too, because she started to say something, some diplomatic phrase meant to diffuse the room, but she was too slow. Dorn stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor, and before anyone in that room could process what was happening, he reached across the table and struck Elena Vasquez across the face. The sound of it filled the entire chamber, a sharp, ugly crack of impact that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. For a moment, absolutely nobody moved. I have relived that moment more times than I care to admit, and I still cannot fully describe the silence that followed. It was not just quiet. It was the kind of silence that has weight to it. the kind that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe, because every single person in that room, human and Dravith both, understood in that instant that something had just broken that could not be unbroken. Sergeant Cole Ramirez did not leap up. He did not shout. He simply uncrossed his arms, slowly, and shifted his weight ever so slightly, like a man settling into a more comfortable stance before watching a show he already knew the ending to. I remember thinking, at the time, that his calm was strange. Now I understand it perfectly. Elena Vasquez turned her head back toward Dorn, slowly. Her cheek was already reddening where his hand had struck her. A thin line of blood traced from the corner of her lip. She did not cry. She did not scream. She did not even look particularly upset, which honestly was more unsettling than if she had. She reached up with one hand, wiped the blood from her lip with her thumb, looked at it for a moment, and then looked back up at Dorn with an expression I can only describe as amused disappointment. The kind of look you give a child who has just done something monumentally stupid and does not yet realize how stupid it was. "You should not have done that," she said quietly. Dorn, still riding the high of whatever rage had briefly consumed him, straightened up and puffed out his chest, clearly expecting fear, or maybe apology, or maybe some kind of retreat. "I will do far worse," he said. "If your delegation continues to disrespect the Dravith Imperium." Ambassador Sol was on her feet now, practically shouting for security, for calm, for anything to stop what was clearly about to become an interstellar incident. Other Dravith officers were rising too, some reaching for weapons they technically were not supposed to have brought into a neutral negotiation chamber, though of course several of us had anyway, because rules are for other people, apparently. And through all of that noise, all of that rising chaos, Elena Vasquez simply stood there, calm, still, watching Dorn the way you watch a storm approaching from a very safe distance. "Commander Dorn," she said, and her voice, though quiet, somehow cut through every other sound in that room. "You were told, at the start of these negotiations, that this station operates under strict neutrality protocols. No weapons, no violence. I would like to point out that I am not carrying a weapon." Dorn sneered. "Then you have nothing to threaten me with." Elena tilted her head slightly. "I did not say I had nothing. I said I was not carrying a weapon." I did not understand what she meant. Not then. Nobody in that room understood what she meant, except for Sergeant Cole Ramirez, who, I now realize, was fighting very hard not to smile. What happened next took less time than it will take me to describe it to you, so understand that everything I am about to tell you occurred across perhaps 4, maybe 5 seconds of real time. But my brain, in its absolute horror and fascination, seemed to slow every single moment down into something I could examine frame by frame, the way you might study a piece of art you cannot quite believe you are looking at. Dorn lunged. Not smart, not calculated, just pure animal reaction, driven by wounded pride and the belief that his size and strength would obviously overwhelm this comparatively small human woman standing across the table from him. Elena moved. I do not have better words for it than that. She simply moved, and where Dorn's massive hand should have connected with her shoulder, there was nothing but air, because she was no longer where she had been half a second earlier. She had shifted her weight to the side, pivoted on one foot, and used his own momentum against him, guiding his outstretched arm past her body with a motion so economical, so precise, it looked almost gentle, like she was helping him along rather than defending herself. Dorn stumbled forward, off balance, and in that half-second of vulnerability, Elena's other hand came up and struck him. Not wildly, not with rage, but with the kind of controlled, surgical precision that suggested this was not the first time she had done something like this. Her palm connected with a pressure point at the side of his neck, and I watched this massive granite-skinned commander, a man who outweighed her by what must have been a factor of 3, stagger sideways like his legs had briefly forgotten how to hold him up. Sergeant Cole Ramirez finally moved, stepping forward, not to help, but simply to clear the space around them, calmly pushing back a chair that had gotten in the way you might tidy up before a guest arrives, except the guest in this case was violence, and it had already arrived. Dorn roared, more out of humiliation than pain, and reached for the ceremonial blade he wore at his hip, a weapon that, again, was technically not supposed to be present in the negotiation chamber, but Dravith tradition insisted certain ranks carry a blade at all times as a symbol of honor. He never got the chance to draw it. Elena closed the distance between them before his hand even reached the hilt. What followed was not the kind of clumsy brawling I had always assumed humans engaged in, based on the handful of entertainment recordings my species had studied. It was fast, and it was quiet, and it was almost beautiful in the most horrifying way possible, like watching a dance choreographed entirely around the intention to end someone's life as efficiently as possible. She caught his wrist before the blade could clear its sheath, twisted, and I heard something crack, a sound that made several of the other Draveth in the room actually gasp. Dorn's roar of anger turned into something higher, sharper, a sound of genuine pain. The first time in his entire adult life, I would guess, that he had experienced anything like it. She took the blade from his now limp grip with the casual efficiency of someone picking up a dropped pen, and then, in a single motion that I am still not entirely sure I processed correctly even as it happened, she turned the blade, stepped into the space his stumbling had created, and ended it. I will not describe every detail of what happened next, because I do not think you need me to, and honestly, I do not particularly enjoy reliving it in that level of detail myself. What I will tell you is this: Commander Craxel Dorn, a man who had never lost an argument, never been challenged, never once in his life been told no by anyone who mattered, fell to the floor of that negotiation chamber in two separate pieces, and the sound his head made hitting that polished floor is a sound I suspect I will hear in my dreams for the rest of my life. The room exploded into chaos. Dravith officers shouted, some drawing weapons, some simply staring in horror, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Ambassador Sol was screaming for security, for medics, for anyone, though it was already far too late for medics to do anything useful. And through all of that noise, Elena Vasquez stood perfectly still, blade still in hand, blood, not her own, spattered faintly across the sleeve of her gray suit. She looked down at Dorn's body with an expression that was not triumphant, not gleeful, not even particularly satisfied. It was almost sad, in a strange way, like she genuinely wished it had not come to this, even though she had clearly known, from the moment his hand had struck her face, exactly how this was going to end. Sergeant Cole Ramirez finally spoke. His first words since the entire incident had begun. "Told you," he said, apparently to no one in particular. He was going to try something. Nobody responded to him. Nobody could. Station security flooded into the chamber moments later, a mix of neutral personnel who worked for Kestrian Hub itself, weapons drawn, shouting for everyone to remain calm, to stand down, to not make things worse. I remember thinking, in the middle of all that panic, how strange it was that the humans in the room were the calmest people present. Elena set the blade down on the table, gently the way you might set down a tool after finishing a job, and raised both hands, palms open, a universal gesture of surrender that felt almost absurd given what had just happened. "He struck me first," she said, her voice steady, addressing the security personnel now flooding into the room. "In front of witnesses, in violation of the neutrality agreement of this station. I acted in self-defense." It was technically true. It was also, I would later learn, an extraordinarily generous description of what had actually occurred, but nobody in that room, human or Dravith, was in any position to argue the finer points of self-defense law at that particular moment. Ambassador Sol, to her credit, managed to regain enough composure to prevent the situation from escalating into an all-out firefight in the middle of a neutral space station. She ordered the Dravith delegation to stand down, reminded everyone, through gritted teeth, that Commander Dorn had indeed violated the terms of the summit by initiating physical violence, and requested, with what I can only describe as tremendous personal restraint, that station security take statements from all present rather than immediate retaliation. The station went into lockdown within the hour. Both delegations were confined to separate sections, communications monitored, movement restricted, while an investigation was conducted into exactly what had happened in that negotiation chamber. I spent the following hours in a holding area with the rest of the junior Dravith staff, and I want to tell you something about the mood in that room because I think it is important. We were terrified, not of punishment, not of consequences, though those certainly weighed on our minds. We were terrified because every single one of us had just watched a video recording of the incident, replayed over and over on the security monitors as investigators reviewed the footage, and every single one of us had come to the same horrifying realization at roughly the same time. Elena Vasquez had not panicked. She had not screamed for help. She had not even looked particularly frightened, not once, from the moment Dorn's hand struck her face to the moment his head hit the floor. She had assessed the situation, calculated her response, and executed it with a level of precision that suggested extensive training, the kind of training that does not come from being a diplomat. One of my colleagues, a young officer named Vrenna, whispered to me, "She is a negotiator. They send negotiators to trade talks, not soldiers." And I remember thinking, and eventually saying out loud, maybe with humans there is less of a difference between those two things than we assumed. That thought stuck with me. It still sticks with me now. Later, station intelligence would confirm what several of us had already begun to suspect. Elena Vasquez was indeed a trained diplomat, holding an advanced degree in interstellar law and negotiation theory. But before that career, she had spent nearly a decade in a branch of human military service that specialized in what their own records vaguely described as high-risk extraction and close-quarters conflict resolution. In simpler terms, she had spent years being dropped into extremely dangerous situations and being expected to walk out of them alive by whatever means necessary. Sergeant Cole Ramirez, it turned out, had served alongside her during several of those years, which explained his complete lack of surprise at what had unfolded in that chamber. He had not been assigned as her security escort because she needed protection. He had been assigned because someone in human command had a sense of humor, and possibly because they wanted a witness present who would not panic and make the situation worse. When I learned all of this, I sat in that holding room and I laughed. I could not help it. It was not the reaction I expected from myself, given the circumstances, but there was something so absurd, so deeply and painfully absurd, about the entire situation that laughter felt like the only appropriate response. My commander, a man who had spent his entire career mocking humans for being fragile, short-lived, and beneath the notice of a proper civilization, had walked into a room, struck a diplomat across the face out of wounded pride, and discovered, in the span of about 5 seconds, that the diplomat in question could and would remove his head from his body with nothing more than her bare hands and his own ceremonial blade. If that is not the single most Dravith thing that has ever happened, I genuinely do not know what is. In the days that followed, as the investigation concluded and the political fallout began, I watched something interesting happen among my own people. There was outrage, of course, plenty of it, demands for retribution, accusations of murder rather than self-defense, but there was also, quietly, beneath all of that noise, a shift in how people spoke about humans. The mockery stopped, almost entirely. Nobody made jokes about human fragility anymore, not even the officers who had been the loudest about it before. Nobody described them as children, or as primitive, or as beneath consideration. The word that started appearing, whispered in hallways, muttered in mess halls, was a word I never expected to hear applied to humans by my own species. Dangerous. Ambassador Sol, in her official report, which I later had the opportunity to read due to my role in the logistical cleanup of the entire incident, wrote something that I think summarizes the entire affair better than I ever could. She wrote that Commander Dorn had made a critical and fatal error in judgment, not because he underestimated human military technology, or human political influence, or human numbers. He underestimated human politeness, mistaking it entirely for weakness, when in reality it was simply the calm surface of something far more capable, held carefully in check because they chose to hold it in check, not because they were incapable of anything else. The negotiations remarkably continued. Not immediately, and not without significant tension, But within a few months, a new Dravith delegation, led by Ambassador Sol herself, sat down again with Elena Vasquez, who had, against what I assumed would be her right to refuse, agreed to continue leading the human delegation. I asked to be reassigned to that new delegation as a logistics officer, partly out of professional necessity, and partly, I will admit, out of a genuine curiosity to see how this strange, terrifying, endlessly composed species conducted business when nobody was foolish enough to slap them across the face. I met Elena Vasquez briefly, during a logistics coordination meeting a few weeks into the renewed talks. I introduced myself, nervously, I will admit, and she shook my hand the same way she had shaken Dorn's hand on that very first day. Firm, brief, professional. "You were in the chamber," she said. "It was not a question." "I was," I admitted. "I have thought about that day rather a lot since." She gave me a small, tired smile. "Most people do." I hesitated, then asked the question that had been sitting in my chest for weeks. "Were you afraid? In that moment before you moved?" She considered the question for a long moment, the way you consider a question you have genuinely thought about yourself. "No," she said eventually. "I was disappointed. He had a chance to be reasonable, and he chose not to be. That is not fear. That is just a waste." I did not have a response to that. I am still not sure I have one now. So here is what I have learned, after everything, after watching my commander's head roll across a polished floor because he could not accept being spoken to as an equal by someone he considered beneath him. We spent generations studying the stars, cataloging species, ranking civilizations by the size of their ships and the age of their empires, and somewhere in all of that careful, arrogant measuring, we forgot to ask the one question that actually mattered. Not how old is this species, not how advanced is their technology. Just this: what have they survived to get here? Humanity survived nearly wiping itself out, more than once, and instead of collapsing, they built something out of the wreckage every single time. They learned to smile calmly at people who insulted them, not because they were weak, but because they had long ago decided that violence was a resource to be spent carefully, not wasted on every provocation that came their way. Commander Craxel Dorn thought he was slapping a diplomat. He was actually slapping the calm, controlled surface of something that had clawed its way out of far worse situations than an arrogant alien commander with more medals than sense, and he found out, in the worst possible way, exactly how thin that surface really was. I do not know if my species will ever fully learn that lesson. Old habits and older egos do not die easily, especially among people who have spent their entire lives being told they are the greatest thing the galaxy has ever produced. But I learned it. I learned it watching a woman calmly wipe blood from her own lip, look at the man who struck her with something closer to disappointment than rage, and then very efficiently remind him, and every single Dravith in that room, that being polite and being harmless are not, in fact, the same thing at all. So if you are listening to this, and you happen to be one of my own kind, allow me to save you a great deal of trouble, and possibly your own head. Do not slap a human. Just do not do it. I do not care how confident you are. I do not care how many medals you are wearing. I do not care how many centuries of history you think gives you the right. Trust me on this one. I watched it happen. I am still not entirely sure I have finished laughing about it, and I do not think I ever will.